For this video, we'll be going over Chapter 3, Segment 3, pages 94 through 101, and we'll begin with the topic of pseudo-conditioning and sensitization. So, this is when a CS can elicit their own responses, complicating an experiment, and sensitization increases strength in an elicited behavior, which takes place due to repeated presentations of eliciting stimulus. On the other hand, pseudo-conditioning is the development of a response to the CS that might occur because mere exposure to the US. So, pseudo-conditioning and sensitization are possible in any conditioning experiment. So, an example of an experiment was conducted by Bernstein in 1978. Pseudo-conditioning and sensitization allowed the possibility in experimenting taste aversion with children. So in this experiment, children who came to the clinic to receive treatment for cancer treatment were given ice cream before the treatment because the treatment often caused children to become nauseous. So they treated this experiment by giving them ice cream before the treatment to produce not such feelings of nauseousness. So we then move on to condition inhibition. And we begin with a term called condition excitation, which is when a CS is associated with a US. And a condition inhibition is when a CS is associated with the absence of a US. So exciters and inhibitors is when the CSs are conditioned with excitation and inhibition. And we come across a famous person who we studied before, Pavlov came across inhibition when studying extinction. And extinction is when a CS is paired with a US that is repeatedly presented without the US. And then we move on to how to produce a condition inhibition. There are several ways or several methods that we can do this, and one of them is called differential inhibition, which is also known as discriminative inhibition. It's a procedure in classical conditioning, and it's when a CS is paired with the US and other stimuli are presented without the US on any other trials. Another method is called the condition inhibition procedure. It's when one CS is always paired with a US, except when the US is combined with a second conditional stimulus. And oftentimes the second conditional stimulus is also known as the compound conditional stimulus. Another procedure is called explicitly unpaired procedure. It's when the CS and the US are never paired, so they go by as unpaired, and it's also known as a negative correlation because the CS and US are negatively correlated. There's also inhibition of delay, which is when the US is presented at the end of a lengthy CS. And then we further move on to detecting condition inhibition. And we can do this by performing a summation test, which is when the inhibitor presented together with a condition exciter. And a true inhibitor will inhibit the response elicited by the exciter. And the original predictions in this is that the stimuli will cause more or less responding. There's also the retardation of acquisition test, when that happens when condition inhibitor is converted into an exciter by pairing it with the US, which responds to the US slowly. The acquisition of responding is known as retarded. We can also detect condition inhibition by bidirectional response systems, which is that the response goes either above or below its baseline level, and bidirectional changes may correspond to the citation of inhibition. Lastly, we move on to two methods that do not produce inhibition, and one of those is latent inhibition, which is when the CS is pre-exposed without a US on a number of trials before conditioning begins. And there's also the CX pre-exposure effect, in which this is what investigators call latent inhibition does not result in the true inhibition.